Good morning. Thank you for joining me this morning. Again, my name is Pat O'Brien. I'm running as a Republican for the state's attorney's office against Kim Foxx. And again, we have another violent week with 15 people shot, one person in custody who, at this point in time, it's not even clear if he's been charged. We've got more crime that's being committed on the streets. And where is Kim Foxx? She's like the Roman emperor. Fox fiddles while these children die. She talks about fighting for racial justice. Well, why doesn't she fight for victims? Why isn't she standing next to Superintendent Brown when he's asking for help? Federal government had an indictment just a couple of days ago where they arrested a number of people for selling drugs openly on the West Side. Open-air drug markets are fueled by Kim Foxx's refusal to charge people who sell drugs with crime. She's dismissed over 600 felony arrests for drug offenses since mid-March. Kim Foxx doesn't know how to do her job. We have to fire Kim Foxx. There's no question about that. The federal government has sent in additional federal officers from the DEA, from Treasury, from ATF. Now, it's not unusual to have Chicago police departments associated with those agencies. As a matter of fact, in my memory for the last 30 years, when I've been practicing criminal law as a prosecutor, a defense attorney, or as a judge sitting on the bench, Chicago Police Department has detailed their officers to those agencies in order to assist. So the fact of having additional federal officers assigned to those agencies is no real change. What is the real change is that we need those additional federal officers. And there's one reason for that, and that is the failure of Kim Foxx to do her job. She has been AWOL. She talks about her desire to have social justice. That is a false premise. You can't have justice if you can't identify who the victim of a crime is, and if you can't fight for that victim of a crime. Our streets are unsafe because of her. We need to make the streets safer. We need to fire Kim Foxx. She's not doing her job, and we need to correct that situation. 4 more years is not going to change. It's going to make it worse. We're going to be tombstone on the lake, and there's no reason for that. I was born and raised in Chicago. I live in this county. I'm not thinking of leaving this county, but how can we let all the crime that's going on make us so unsafe? We have to get rid of this state's attorney. Fire Kim Foxx. Now, if there are any questions, I'll be certainly glad to try to answer them.
Pat, Pat, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Pat, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so if you were debating Kim Foxx right now, what metrics would you throw at her or ask her to explain to support your view that she's not prosecuting and putting away violent offenders?
Well, certainly I'd start with her record on gun crimes. She has, in her 3.5 years, and I'm going to repeat this, lost more gun trials than she's won. That's a hard record to accomplish, especially when you talk about concentrating on violent crime. So I'm going to mention some of the individual situations which point this out. She had a Daryl Young, who in April of 2020, in April of 2020, he was charged with aggravated possession of a weapon. He was placed on electronic monitoring, and we all know, especially those of you that report on a daily or frequent basis on the criminal courts, electronic monitoring essentially is an empty attempt to monitor the behavior of people who are awaiting trial. And Daryl Young is a good example. Daryl Young, while on electronic monitoring, essentially went outside his residence and was absent for 6 days. They put out an alert to try to arrest him, and when they arrest him, guess what Daryl Young has in his possession? Another weapon. So here's a person who is put on electronic monitoring just months ago for a gun, and he's caught with another gun.
But is the electronic monitoring a problem of Kim Foxx? Are you saying she's asking and accepting that? Or is it a problem of Tim Evans and the judges he supervises, the bail judges, going ahead and approving or using electronic monitoring as a part of bail? So who's the problem here? Is it Tim Evans and the judges he supervises, or is it Kim Foxx?
I don't think you can clear anyone of this problem. I think it's Tim Evans, I think it's Preckwinkle, and I think it's Fox. And as for the judges, essentially they're under the thumb or control of Tim Evans. And the problem is this. We've placed, since the COVID virus, another 1,000 people on electronic monitoring. They were overwhelmed before that with 2,000 persons who they were monitoring on any particular day. And that was being monitored by only 20 sheriffs. Now we've got 3,000 persons being monitored by those same 20 sheriffs on any shift. Tom Dart has complained about this. He's asked for more resources. He's been ignored. Kim Foxx has a duty to complain and do that vocally. She has a duty to say electronic monitoring has to be supplemented by global positioning notation, so you can find out when a person is not in the residence where they're supposed to be, where exactly they are. Maybe we could have found out about Mr. Young before 6 days had elapsed and he did God knows what while he had another weapon.
I have a question in terms of the federal agents that are going to be, or maybe they're already there in Chicago. What is the hope that are these troops and these federal agents? I'm assuming that they're not the National Guard; they're military police troops. What do you hope will be accomplished by this?
Well, my understanding from looking at the press reports and reading about this is I don't think they're military police. As I indicated, there are a number of federal agencies that are stationed, they're departments stationed in Chicago as they are in other cities, such as DEA, Drug Enforcement, ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, the Marshal Service, and other Homeland Security kinds of agencies. So we've had those agencies here. We actually have had, at least for 30 years, to my knowledge, Chicago police officers who are detailed to those agencies. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, there were over 70 police officers attached to the 3 or 4 of those agencies. I'm guessing that's still in practice. So the agents that are being sent here are agents who work for those agencies, but just prior to coming here had not been stationed in Chicago or the Northern District. So it's getting more ATF agents, more drug enforcement agents, more marshals officers. So those aren't military police. Those are actually federal employees who work specifically on certain kinds of criminal behavior, whether it's guns, whether it's drugs. So I don't feel there's a problem with, are these going to be rogue, somehow agents that are not under the control and supervision of the appropriate kinds of offices. I don't feel there's a need, but the need is this. We never needed these people before. And now all of a sudden for 3.5 years, here's Kim Foxx, who decides that the best way to be the chief law enforcement officer in this county is not to enforce the law. Back in 2019, the Chicago Police Department presented her with 100 individuals that they felt they had evidence to support a charge of murder. And she looked at them and said, no. Well, how many of those people do you think are out shooting up funerals, are out protecting drug territory, are out doing the kinds of things that make us less safe? The kids are dying, the streets are unsafe, and it's Kim Foxx. Fire her.
So these federal agents are going to be charging people with criminal activity that on a federal level rather than Kim Foxx. So it sounds to me as if the federal agents are stepping in where Kim Foxx is not willing to charge. So these people are going to be facing federal rather than state charges. Is that correct?
That is correct. In connection with gun crimes, the state's attorney's office, when I was there, had state's attorneys that were co-designated as prosecutors for the U.S. Attorney's Office and the state's attorney's office. And when it was better in terms of getting a greater sentence on a person who had been arrested for a gun, we'd basically let that case be handled by the federal government. In this situation, Kim Foxx appears to be doing nothing. As I indicated, if you were the U.S. attorney or even the president of the United States and you knew what her record was on gun offenses, would you want her to be handling a case where you had a very significant violent felon caught with a gun and say, okay, Ms. Foxx, go ahead, try that case and do your best to lose it? So this is a situation where it's been recognized that she is not doing her job, whether it comes to drugs, which she is not charging, whether it comes to guns, where the cases are charged and she's losing them. So it's a recognition of her ineffectiveness.
So what are the pros and cons of being charged federally rather than on state level for these gun charges?
Well, typically on a gun charge, the federal government is looking for someone who, when arrested, they determined from prior history that they have other convictions. And it's those other convictions that make that person eligible for a greater sentence. If a person was arrested with a gun and had no prior convictions, absent any other kind of activity which might aggravate that gun, that case probably would be handled by the state's attorney's office. And under this state's attorney, probably lost.
Judge, one of the problems that it seems like knowledgeable people are saying is different this year and perhaps for at least the last few years is the structure of gangs. The number of gangs, the number of sort of sub-gangs, much larger than before. You haven't seemed to mention that at all, at least this morning. How important is the gang issue? And if you were state's attorney, what would you do differently than Kim Foxx to deal with the gang issue I've just described?
Well, I'm certainly glad you asked the question. As I've indicated on prior occasions, and I'll indicate again today, gangs account for at least 50 or 60% of the circumstances in which homicides are occurring in Chicago, and that's according to police. This is a situation where you've got to have prosecutors who are embedded with the gang officers, and you've got to have them where they have experience and have some ability with gangs, guns, and drugs, because that's the triumvirate. That's the unholy triumvirate that the city faces. So you have to have, and I would increase that unit, which is a rackets unit, to 30 persons. Right now it stands at something like maybe 20, and there are no gun prosecutors in that unit. There are no drug prosecutors in that unit. I would increase it. I would put them at the very first level of investigations. And I know that there are more gangs and they're more fragmented, but essentially you can, in fact, look at, and when you get an investigation like the shooting that occurred at the funeral home, you know who the gangs are. For God's sakes, get a grand jury up, pull the gang members in front of that grand jury, and start to break down this wall of silence that the gangs put up.
Why do you suppose Kim Foxx isn't doing that? Why is it your assertion that she's going easy on gangs? And if so, why do you think she's doing that?
It's my assertion that her belief is that somehow racial justice doesn't involve actually putting violent criminals in jail. She's seen what happened to Amy Klobuchar. Kim Foxx has her eyes set on higher office, and being a good prosecutor, which means being effective and actually putting people in jail, is not the way to get there. She does not want to have a reputation as a prosecutor who's effective.
How would
would you balance, the calls for social justice or for racial justice with your duties to prosecute and, as you say, put more people in jail?
Well, the bottom line is you don't put everyone in jail if, in fact, they deserve a break because of the kind of crime they're charged with and their absence of any kind of criminal background. You always balance that out. That's been balanced out historically. Somehow Kim Foxx comes on the scene and thinks she's the only person that ever thought about deterring people out of the system when it's appropriate. The second chance that is embedded in the statutes, that was put in there by Anita Alvarez back in 2013. That's not Kim Foxx. And the unit that essentially looks at convictions to see if there's a problem based on our ability now to do DNA, that was put there by Dick Devine. That's not Kim Foxx. What Kim Foxx has added to all this is a bail statute that's a failure, that's let violent criminals out without an ability to monitor them. And this is not a situation. She can hide behind a rubric or a nice phrase, but when that phrase essentially hides all the violence and the shooting and the killing of these children, it's an empty phrase. Of course you're going to have and you're going to seek justice, racially, ethnically, religiously. You're not going to put people in jail where you can deter and divert them out of the system. But you can't talk about slogans or phrases when the reality is so different and so violent and so bloody. The innocents are being slaughtered so she can talk about racial justice and how she wants to save the environment. Her job is to prosecute violent criminals. She's not doing it.
Well, what would you say to activists who are protesting things like police brutality and systematic racism right now to make them feel more comfortable with your candidacy if you were to become state's attorney?
Well, there's no question that no matter how many people vote for you, even if it's you win the office by only one, it's a job of the state's attorney to have the community behind him. It's the job of the state's attorney to convince the people that didn't vote for him that, in fact, he's going to be fair, he's going to follow the law and follow the facts. Now, in terms of racial justice, my God, and the shooting that occurred at the funeral home in Gresham, if, in fact, the persons in that car are described as African Americans shooting African Americans, I don't think in order to achieve racial justice, you go and arrest white people, okay? If, in fact, you're having black-on-black crime, for God's sakes, prosecute the people where you have evidence who committed the crime. You can't turn away from that. You can't talk about having racial justice and trying to achieve it by not prosecuting the people committing violent crime. These neighborhoods are at risk. They're crying out for somebody to step up. The only voice of the dead in this town is the state's attorney. And when she's silent or gives a whole bunch of phrases that may sound comforting but are empty, we've got to change that.
And I'm going to follow up about that really quick. What did you say that? I'm sorry. You said that the shooters were described as African American, but that white people were charged?
What I'm saying is this, that if there's black-on-black crime, you don't achieve racial justice by looking for somebody who's European white. How can you, and that's what she does. She doesn't want to prosecute anybody. You've got to make these neighborhoods safe. These kids are all of our kids. They're not just the fathers and mothers and the families and friends who mourn for them. They're all of ours. We all live in this community. You can't talk about racial justice and ignore crime.
But that would be, police would be investigating the crime. Why would police be looking for someone of European descent?
You didn't hear what I said. I said racial justice involves prosecuting the people who are described as committing the crime. And if you're asking me why I gave that example, I gave that example because Kim Foxx ignores crime. She ignores that, and the very neighborhoods that she thinks she's defending, they're the ones that are suffering.
Well, what about those neighborhoods of people of color who say that they are over-policed and they are over-prosecuted and the system is stacked against them?
Well, I don't know that everybody, sometimes the voices that are loudest are not the voices that essentially reflect the entire community. There will be second chances for every person who is deserving of it. But if you commit a rape, if you commit a murder, if you commit an armed robbery, the law doesn't say you're going to get a second chance. If there's evidence of that, there are consequences. But people that commit or are accused of financial crimes or accused of crimes which are at the lower level, and especially if they don't have a background, we're going to divert those people out of the system. The idea of somehow putting everybody in jail is an idea that I'm sure Kim Foxx will try to peddle when she actually addresses me, but it's not something that I'm looking to do. It's not something that I did when I was a prosecutor or when I was a defense attorney defending people accused of crime, or when I was sitting on a bench as a judge. Kim Foxx essentially has no experience. She just has empty phrases.
Pat, harder on drug crime, but take it easier on financial crimes?
Well, if you're asking me about drug crimes, as Superintendent Brown says, and as I think people that are either police officers or prosecutors know, drugs are the fuel for gangs being able to survive. And guns are the way they protect that fuel that allows them to thrive. So you can't ignore drug sellers, or else you're essentially encouraging the gangs, giving them money, making it so that they can buy weapons, so they can live a lifestyle which doesn't require them to be lawful. So in that sense, you've got to prosecute people that sell drugs. Now, people that use drugs, those people are diverted out of the system all the time and will continue when I'm state's attorney to be diverted out of the system. And hopefully put in programs where they can not come back into the system. There are people in the communities, whether it's in the city or the suburbs, people like Pastor Corey Brown, people like Father Flager. They want to help these people, and they are helping these people. I'm going to partner with them to make sure that the persons that are at risk, but are at risk because of low-level criminal behavior, that they partner with these pastors and priests and activists that essentially are trying to do better.
Pat, one of the things that the supporters of Kim Foxx refer to, that they say, anybody would say you have to deal with, they would say this, is the history of the state's attorney's office, the culture that they contend is still a part of the state's attorney's office. They talk about going back to the 1970s, the Ed Hanrahan days as state's attorney, and the shooting of Fred Hampton and others. They would take you up to the time of Anita Alvarez and the go-slow indictment of more than a year for Jason Van Dyke and the cover-up and so forth of the video. Is that a part still of the culture of the state's attorney's office? And would you acknowledge that? And if you came in as state's attorney, is that one of the things you would have to deal with?
Well, obviously,
historical culture. Yeah,
well, every
long question. Historical culture.
I understand.
There's still some problem with the office, and you were there. You were a prosecutor in that office. Did you see that? Is it still something that needs to be dealt with?
Well, I would say this. Ed Hanrahan preceded my time. I was hired by Bernie Carey, who essentially, I think, was a very good state's attorney. I worked under Bernie Carey, Rich Daley, Cecil Partee, and Jack O'Malley. And I thought all of them did their job and obeyed their oath. Now, the question of Hanrahan and, the Black Panther raid, that's prior to my time. It's something, quite frankly, that I never want to see ever happen again. It shouldn't have happened in the first place. The office never had that occur ever again. I think the state's attorneys that were elected represented the idea that they needed and there would be a change from what Hanrahan had done. Now, as to the failure or timely charge Officer Van Dyke, I'm going to say this. I wasn't in that office either. I may have handled that situation differently. I may have looked at, having dealt with both the federal government or the U.S. Attorney's Office and the state's attorney's office, and used my judgment and experience to know that you can't allow another office which has priorities, which may not be the same as yours, and timelines that may not be the same as yours. You can't allow them to control your decision making. You can't allow them to essentially usurp your power. There is no way in the world that I'm going to let, whether it's a U.S. Attorney's Office or anyone else, essentially carry on the responsibilities of the state's attorney. When there's criminal activity and it's investigated and shown to violate the law, that's when you charge. That's when you try to make sure that the case is handled in an appropriate way, that it gets to disposition trial in a way that doesn't take decades or years. You've got to do it in a way that gives people confidence. Like I said, not everybody's going to vote for me. I'm hoping enough vote for me so I'd be state's attorney. But everybody has to believe that you're doing the right thing and that you're doing it based on law and facts.
Yeah, what do you think about the rhetoric that the president has used to send the federal agents to Chicago? And are you a supporter of President Trump?
I'm running as a Republican, which means that, and in terms of the office of the president, I support the office of the president, of course. Have there been situations where I disagreed with his language, where I disagreed with how he's spoken of people? Absolutely. My point is this: I am not a politician. I really never have been one, and people that have dealt with me are probably aware of that, and it's probably all too obvious a lot of times. I'm a professional. I want to handle the office professionally. In terms of what the president says or does, that's another office that's going to be voted on in November. Whoever people vote for in that office or vote to have either stay president or become a new president, I'm going to work with that person, and I'm not going to shy away from it. We need all the help we can get, but I'm not going to usurp somebody else's belief as to who they should vote for. I'm gonna basically ask people to vote for me, to look at this office separately, because it is a separate office. It's unique. You don't get a Republican, Democratic state's attorney, a black state's attorney, a white state's attorney sitting in that same seat. You get one state's attorney. They've got to understand they represent everybody, that there are views across the political spectrum and across the spectrum of ideas, and you've got to be able both to appreciate, to listen, and where it's appropriate, to modify your own views.
Do you support the Trump administration sending in DHS law enforcement folks to protect federal buildings in Portland? Do you support that?
Well, I've never been to Portland, so I'm going to say this. If that issue were to come up in Cook County, I'd deal with it, and I'd deal with it appropriately. I'd try to get all the viewpoints, but essentially we're not talking about that in Cook County. We're talking about officers from the federal government whose agencies are already here, whose agencies in this last week actually indicted a number of people on the west side for selling drugs openly, agents who effectively have challenged and gotten gun convictions where Fox has omitted them. So my belief is this: the kinds of help that is being sent is the kinds of help we already have. It's just in more numbers. It's worked, but unfortunately not worked well enough, and that's why we need the numbers. And one of the reasons we need them is because Fox basically is a failure.
Do you know the U.S. Attorney? Do you know U.S. Attorney John Walsh, and have you spoken with him about any of this?
I don't know John Walsh. I certainly want to work with him. If I'm state's attorney, I would work with him. I knew the U.S. attorneys that were in the office when I was in the late 80s and early 90s, and worked with them, Falukas and various others. As a matter of fact, one of the U.S. attorneys actually was a former assistant state's attorney, was there. Another of the U.S. attorneys had been Fred Foreman, who was a former state's attorney up in Lake County. So you know them, you work with them, you understand what their responsibilities are, and you try as best you can to make sure that both systems, state and federal, do the best they can to make the city safer, make the county safer.
Do you know if Kim Foxx has met with U.S. Attorney John Walsh? And if she hasn't, would you recommend she do so?
Well, I would recommend she do so. I'm just wondering, has she met with Dan Webb yet? That's my thought. I mean, there's a situation I'd like to see. Maybe somebody should have Ms. Fox under oath and we should try to find out why she did what she did in the Smollett case.
Will we hear more from Dan Webb prior to the election? And what do you think he ought to be doing now? What are you looking for to happen?
Well, I don't know. I'm hoping we hear from him because it'd be a crime for people to vote for Kim Foxx if, in fact, within September or October, after they cast their votes, she's indicted for criminal behavior. That'd be another crime. He doesn't take me into his confidence. I wouldn't expect that he would. He's been appointed to be a special state's attorney prosecutor. I'm hoping that he finishes his job. One of the things I'm sure he knows, I don't need to tell him, he is an excellent attorney, an excellent prosecutor, is obviously you need that grand jury. There's probably been some problems either getting a new one or keeping the one he has running. So you need them. You need to put people in front of the grand jury. You need people under oath. There's a whole chain of persons who were part of the Smollett fiasco, and you need basically to work up that chain to figure out, when people are under oath, what exactly happened.
Can grand juries meet in the COVID era?
Oh, absolutely. They were meeting. The grand jury now in our state consists of 16 people coming in. There have to be 13 people of that 16 present. Given the number and the fact that you can actually set them up, not just in the grand jury room at 26th Street, you can call them into an auditorium, space them out easily 6 feet apart, and just have a seat and a bench in front where the witnesses can testify and be sworn. So it's a much more readily adaptable kind of situation than jury trials may be. You know where the people are. You can sit them. They don't have to necessarily get into a small room and come to a decision. They can come to their decision in this bigger room. So I don't think it presents an insurmountable problem, but it probably has presented them with some challenges.
You're calling on the U.S. Attorney to increase its prosecution of gang and gun crime. What do you expect the U.S. Attorney's Office to do differently from the federal agents?
Well, the federal agents essentially will be part of the investigation, which gives the U.S. Attorney's Office the ability to prosecute. A lot of times that the federal agents, they obviously, and the federal government, has a eavesdropping or overhear statute which allows conversations to be recorded, and you don't need one party to the conversation to consent. The state statute requires that one party consent. So they've got that tool, which at this point the county state's attorneys don't have. And I would suggest that Kim Foxx should be down in Springfield asking the legislators to amend our overhear eavesdropping statute so we don't need consent to investigate bribery and official misconduct. Because from what I've read in the paper and what the reporters like yourselves have reported on, there's a little bribery and misconduct that's going on by elected officials. So it wouldn't be a bad tool for the state's attorney to assist the federal government in prosecuting corrupt elected officials and not leaving it just to the federal government.
So it sounds like I have a follow-up question to that question. It sounds like you're saying that you want the U.S. Attorney's Office to support the federal agents and whatever they come up with.
Well, I mean, that's obvious. That prosecutors, whether state or federal, they fit into this line of from an activity that's committed that's criminal to the investigation of the activity, to the arrest of the person or persons, to what happens to that person or persons before a trial, and then to the trial itself. At every one of those stages, a prosecutor on a federal level is going to be part of that decision making, and on a state level, the county prosecutor is part of that decision making and activity. So these federal agents are not just there to essentially, spend a couple of nights in Chicago hotels. They're going to be working cases. There's enough, unfortunately, because of our inactivity by Kim Foxx, there's enough criminal activity to basically investigate. If they see persons that are arrested with guns, if they see persons who are committing criminal activity, I expect them to make arrests, to refer those arrests to the appropriate agency, and depending upon the background, it might be the county prosecutor. If they refer those to the county prosecutor and it's Fox, God knows you might see a revolving door and the person will be on the streets within hours.
Are you saying the state's attorney ought to be doing more on public corruption, prosecution, and enforcement, and specifically she should be looking at some of the very same activities we're hearing about that involve Con Ed and Speaker Mike Madigan?
It's exactly what I'm saying. If you look at the list of persons and entities that have donated politically to her campaign, it includes Safe Speed, it includes the CEO of Safe Speed, it includes ComEd PAC, obviously it includes Mr. Burke, it includes Sandoval. She doesn't have to look far to see persons who should have been investigated and should be investigated for criminal behavior. I mean, they're right on her campaign donation list. And you just can't have the feds doing this alone. Because if they could do it alone, and if it stopped all this, we wouldn't see governor after governor and legislator and elected official after elected official get caught up in these continuing problems.
Does Kim Foxx have a conflict of interest on this issue, and does she have to recuse herself from any such investigations?
Well, I don't know that you can have a conflict of interest if you don't do anything. And she doesn't have to give a phony recusal from any investigation because she's not doing any investigations. So I think the first issue is, well, do something, and if it occurs that there is some appearance of impropriety because of prior donations or prior contact, then there's a whole process that I think she should now be aware of, as she wasn't aware in Smollett. You go to the chief judge. The chief judge essentially contacts all the state's attorneys in the other counties, contacts the attorney general. If none of those persons are available or willing, goes to a private attorney who gets appointed. But we're not even at that point. We're not even close. And I'm going to ask you this. When's the last time that you heard any whisper of what Kim Foxx was doing to attempt to investigate public corruption? She's doing nothing.
As a former prosecutor and judge, do you think Speaker Mike Madigan, do you think there's enough evidence that's out in the public about Speaker Mike Madigan that, in your view, he ought to step down as Speaker as well as step down as Chairman of the Illinois Democratic Party?
I have no problem criticizing politicians, Democrat or Republican. At this point in the public domain, I'd be hesitant to say that someone has committed a crime. They haven't been charged yet.
But should he step down? Should he step down? Is there a point where its evidence is so strong, short of an indictment, short of a conviction, that you think a person in that official capacity ought to step down?
What I'd say is this. You've got a governor that's telling him to step down, but I don't know that a Republican candidate for state's attorney would somehow be the appropriate person to say a Democratic legislator down in Springfield should step down. And I don't think he'd listen to me. He's not listening to the governor. And even the governor probably has something to answer for. Maybe he should have decided to keep those toilets in his mansion.
When the governor says that the allegations are true, what do you suppose that means? What does the governor have to have in order for him to call for the Speaker to step down? He's not saying that. He says if the allegations are true, he ought to step down.
Well, I can't answer for the governor. All I can say is that the governor can ask him to step down. Apparently, he's not stepping down. The Democratic Party, has all the votes down in the legislature. They can, if they had, a willingness to do that, they could do it. I just think it's something that, for me to weigh in on, publicly, it just doesn't seem to be a decision and some statement that I want to make.
I wanted to circle back, if we could, to the federal agents in Chicago and ask a quick question about,
Sure.
The reports that we've been hearing out of Portland. Are you concerned about that at all, and about similar actions taking place in Chicago?
Well, I don't think I'm concerned. Obviously, we'll kind of get, proof in the pudding when certain day, and certainly when this weekend passes. And the reason I'm not concerned is that it appears that the persons they sent into Portland were only Homeland Security, that there was no attempt to have them integrated with existing federal agencies like there's DEA in Portland, there's ATF in Portland, there's Marshal Services in Portland. There was no attempt to integrate those persons they sent with existing agencies that are already there, that had obviously a hierarchy of authority, that had worked with the state and local city officials. So I'm not concerned about that, because the people, as I understand it, that are coming in are from those very agencies that we already have here, that have a structure of authority in place, and that essentially will fit in just like the agents that are presently here. So I don't have that concern.
Is that why it appears the mayor seems to have consented now to Trump sending in these folks for the very reason you said? This is different from Portland. Is that your understanding? Is that why, at least to this extent, the mayor and the president are on the same page?
It appears so. Like I said, 30 years in running, we've had these agencies here, and it's been longer than that, and we've had Chicago Police Department assigned to them. So this is nothing new.
If it's nothing new, why hold a press conference today saying that you welcome the 200 agents?
Well, the new part of it is that the agents are necessary because Kim Foxx is not doing her job. And if she was, have you heard about any prosecution of any of the kinds of violent crimes that have occurred? We're now at something like over 400 homicides in Chicago, 50% more than we were at this time last year. She's not doing her job. The agents are necessary to try to cut down on gun cases that she can't win. My God. So I thank you for all the questions. You've been very polite, and you certainly have been patient with me, but I have to move on, and thank you very much.